Recently, I uploaded a first impressions video for The Witcher 1. It was made after I spent a few hours with the game, and if you want to learn more about my weird history with Witcher 1 and get additional context for this video, then I highly recommend that you watch the other one first. It'll be in the description. The most important thing that I said in it, though, probably is the fact that I did briefly try the game back in 2019, but it's important to keep in mind that I experienced about 80% of the game for the first time in the past 2 months or so. In that video, I also said that I would upload another video to share my thoughts on the entire experience as soon as I would be done with the main story, and this is what today's video is all about. The Witcher 1 might be an old game, but I'm really glad that I got to finally experience it in its entirety, and I'm extremely excited to talk about it again today, this time more in depth. I intend to split the video in many parts, and in each part I'll focus on a specific core aspect of the game. So there'll be a section dedicated to the graphics, the story, etc. So without any further ado, let's jump into the review and conveniently start with the thing that I probably hated the most, which is the combat. Unfortunately, I thought that the combat system in Witcher 1 was mostly boring, and it usually got in the way of the other things that I actually enjoyed about the game. Of course, I had a taste of the combat system back in 2019 when I briefly played the game. Therefore, this time around, before jumping in, I decided to put the game on the easiest difficulty to try to make the combat encounters both shorter and easier for me. It goes against what I usually do. For example, I almost always play Witcher 3 on Death March, which is the hardest difficulty. But despite that, I think that my different approach with Witcher 1 was the good call, and I think it improved my experience significantly with the game actually. Now, to get a bit more specific about what I hated about it, I would say that I'm not a big fan of the rhythm system overall. It feels clunky and just uninteresting to me. It's also quite repetitive. It can lead to many of the fights feeling quite similar. Dodging almost feels bad because you break your combos. Things like the signs and the stance system definitely add a bit more depth, but in my opinion, it's just not enough to make me care, if I'm being honest. I would say that I have a similar opinion of Alchemy. I kind of like it actually, but I don't care about the combat, and a lot of the time they kind of go hand in hand, so it kind of just made Alchemy irrelevant to my experience. At least I could find some other interesting things during the combat, and so for example, I really enjoyed many of the monster models, combat music, or even the story elements that were tied to the encounters. I know that I've talked quite negatively about the system overall, but while I was playing more and more, I actually kind of got used to it, and it stopped bothering me as much as it did at the beginning. If I had to summarize how I feel about the combat, I would just say that, again, I mostly don't care. It's not gonna stop me from playing the game again, but it also certainly won't be the reason why I come back. Moving on, let's talk about the graphics. So, okay, I'd say that they look dated, but I don't hate them. In fact, I would actually say that I love the graphics in The Witcher 1. As I kept progressing in the game, I was constantly blown away by the locations, and it just felt really good to explore the world. I really enjoyed the diversity of the landscapes between the chapters. They all have their unique feel, and that's obviously a great thing. I thought that the art style overall was very enjoyable, but of course, that's highly dependent on your personal preferences and what you are personally looking for. Another thing that I think is worth mentioning is that often the game feels, at least it felt darker than The Witcher 3 to me. But it's something that was achieved with more than only the graphics, as I'll discuss later. Next, I want to talk about the music, and I'll just start by saying that the soundtrack is absolutely fabulous. To my great pleasure, it's something that holds true for the entirety of the trilogy, and the opening sequence actually makes it clear that the first game will be no exception in that regard because it starts with some absolutely epic music. Most of the soundtrack sounds familiar and quote-unquote normal for a Witcher game, while still having, I guess, its own identity, but then you also have a few very distinct songs, which is something that I can absolutely appreciate. For example, there is the Golem fight theme, Discovering and listening to the soundtrack of the game was absolutely one of my favorite parts of the experience, without a doubt. It's something that I care about a lot in a game personally, therefore I definitely had high expectations for it, especially after playing the first 2 games, and yeah, it did not disappoint. Okay, enough about the music, let's move on again, and this time around we're gonna talk about something that I think is quite important about the game, or at least for me, because it's definitely the thing that I enjoyed the most about the game, and it's the atmosphere and the immersion. It can be hard to describe or put into words what I felt, but the first word that comes to my mind, I guess, is that the places, the cities, the swamps, everything just felt very believable, and that in turn leads to better immersion. It just feels like you're a part of a real and functioning place, almost. The soundtrack, the various sounds, and the visual design of the areas all seem to fit extremely well together, and it creates this realistic and cohesive experience that I just described. While it is also done well in the other Witcher games, there is something unique about how it's done in this game. Something truly worth experiencing, and for the people who enjoy immersing themselves inside of a game, I think Witcher 1, at least in my case, it might be the best game that I have played in that regard. I think it's also worth mentioning before moving on that I've seen a lot of people online claiming that Witcher 1 is probably the best Witcher game when it comes to replicating the Slavic atmosphere, and I can't really comment too much because I don't know much about Slavic atmosphere, if that makes sense. But I think it's still something interesting to point out. Okay, let's talk characters. CDPR once again succeeded in making me care about their characters, although I would say that their approach seemed a bit different. I felt like in Witcher 1 the amount of characters that we meet seemed to be lower, and the characters that are introduced instead return a lot more throughout the story, which really helps give the characters more depth, especially in a shorter game. For example, Dandelion would almost always show up, sometimes in the most unlikely of ways, but I don't really care, it still works. Even when a character is not physically present, for example Shani in chapter 4 I believe, you get to read a letter from her, and again it's just an example to show that there's an effort being made to include the characters almost at any point of the story. It is also nice to have a big choice to make between Triss and Shani. I decided to go with Shani, but I would say that Geralt and Shani were not really together by the end. I think it's because of that dialogue.
Shani, I've thought a lot about us. A life together, a family.
Me too.
Let's not fool ourselves. It's impossible, not here, not now. We are who we are, and neither of us wants to change.
So yeah, I think that by the end of the game, Geralt was back on the path and alone. At least in my case. In terms of villains, I loved the Professor and Azar Javed. Their trick at the tower where Azar Javed took Raymond's appearance after killing him was a sad but great moment. I actually really enjoyed Raymond's character, so yeah, I was a bit shocked. He was a good friend until the end, and he was very smart. Maybe not so much when he got murdered, but it's the risks of the trade, I guess. Jörg de Aldersberg was another great character. The techniques that he employed might have been far from ideal, but his character had stupid, yet interesting motives, I'd say. So yeah, the villains were not the most developed, or I guess they did not have much depth, but I still thought that they were entertaining, and whenever they would show up on the screen, it was usually a good time. But yeah, overall, if I really wanted to mention more interesting characters, I could probably go on for a while. You know, Siegfried, Thaler, Foltest, Triss, and a lot more, but really what matters is that the game is full of interesting characters, and yeah, that's the important part. One thing that I want to add in this section though is that the dialogue, both the voice acting and the words that are spoken, ranged from really good to meme-worthy, and it almost feels like it was intended from time to time. Like they almost try to make it funny with how cringe it is. I don't mind it too much, but I would definitely say that the quality was what I would describe as inconsistent. It might be due to limited budget and resources. Really, it's not that bad, but I still wanted to mention it. So yeah, to conclude this section about the characters, I would say that, like I said earlier, things felt more connected than they do in Witcher 3 to me, and that the game definitely succeeded completely when it comes to creating memorable characters, both the allies of Geralt, but also the villains. Alright, the next logical thing to talk about is probably the story, because it's what involves the characters. It's an interesting plot, and throughout the game, I think each chapter makes significant enough progress and is interesting enough to keep the players hooked. At least it worked for me. And every chapter had its own share of epic moments, but if I had to state the ones that stood out to me, I would say in chapter 1, there was the confrontation with the Reverend and deciding Abigail's fate. In chapter 2, probably the death of Raymond and the whole plan of Azar Javed at the tower. Chapter 3, I think it was probably my favorite chapter overall. I really enjoyed seeing characters from the books make a return, like Princess Ada and Velrad. I knew Ada and Velrad because I'm done reading the first book. I'm currently in Blood of Elves, so yeah, it was enjoyable to see some characters that I knew make a comeback. And also the reveal of Vincent being a werewolf, I think it's in chapter 3. It was quite epic. It was quite epic. And also, we even get to kill the professor towards the end. So it's an action-packed chapter, and I think it was really the moment where I was like, okay, the story is really, really enjoyable right now. Chapter 4 was a nice breath of fresh air, especially visually. And the most important moment in the chapter was probably at the end with the confrontation between the Order of the Flaming Rose and the Elves. I decided to side with the Order because at the time, I was like, the Order is probably going to kill the Elves regardless of who I side with right now. So I decided to side with the Order, not because I agreed with them, but because I didn't want the Order to become an unnecessary rival of Geralt right now. And that decision definitely had a bigger impact than I had hoped or anticipated. There are constantly impactful and important choices for the player to make that will result in big consequences. Of course, that's one of the things that make The Witcher special, and it's a key aspect of this game as well. Also, honorable mention to the scene where the Lady of the Lake knighted Geralt.
That is your oath. Arise, a knight. Destiny will give you no rest. A long road lies ahead. I see death and blood. I see frosty chaos.
Finally, chapter 5, I enjoyed the quest where Ada turns into a Striga. Again, the execution of removing the curse was far from perfect, in my opinion. In my case, I pretty much just ran for a few minutes and it worked, but just the idea of experiencing a similar situation to the one in the first book was amazing. And towards the end of the chapter, Geralt kills Azar Javed with the help of Berengar. That was definitely epic. And then to conclude the story, there's the epilogue. It's the confrontation with Jog the Aldersberg, aka Alvin. And I have not talked about Alvin at all so far in the video, and I have extremely mixed feelings about this character. I felt like some big things were coming, and while the twist that he is actually Jacques did surprise me, I don't think that I feel really satisfied with his ending. I guess I would describe it as wasted potential more than anything. While confronting Jacques in the Vision of the White Frost, I loved having some of Geralt's allies fighting with him. I mean, how cool is it to fight with a Striga on your side? It's only a vision, but I liked it a lot. Okay, now for fun, let's rank every chapter from worst to best. Keep in mind, it's only my opinion, and I think they were all good, so even the worst is still good. So I would say, again, from worst to best, the second, the first, the fifth, the fourth, and then the best one, like I said earlier, is the third. The prologue and epilogue were both great as well. I don't know where they would rank, but I don't think they deserve to be ranked on this list because they're much shorter. So yeah, it's a great story to experience for any fan of story-driven RPGs, and obviously I think that any Witcher fan will have a great time with the storyline. In the last category, I want to talk about quest design and structure. I mostly did not have an issue with the design of the quests. It's mostly similar to what you'd expect from quests coming from Witcher 3. But it does differ from time to time, and usually not in a good way. This will greatly depend on what you enjoy as a player, but for me, I like an easy and clear structure to progress in the quests. I don't like feeling stuck or feeling like I probably missed something crucial for the quest, because then you start going back and forth, testing everything, and nothing is working, and you end up having to search on the internet to figure out how to progress. I much prefer the depth to come in the form of optional additional information, like in Witcher 3 a lot of the time, with hidden books to add more lore or things like that. One specific example of something that I hated would be the quest with the Vodunoi priest in chapter 4. I had to do some things to get the priest to come back to his altar. I tried so many things, and my quest marker was still taking me to the altar where the priest stayed before, but he was nowhere to be found. I think in the end what I needed to do was continue another quest, which finally made him return, and it's fine. It's not a big problem, it's just I was focusing on that quest and the information that was given to me was not enough to make the quest structure clear. Of course, like with most of my complaints so far, it's nothing significant and it was never enough to change my opinion of the game, but I would be lying if I said that it never led to some frustration. Now, let's talk alcohol.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Strong, but good.
I kind of hated the effects of alcohol actually, and how you walk extremely slowly after consuming it. I think that there are two ways to remove the effects: meditate or drink a specific potion that I think I never even found, or that I think I was never able to craft it, but I could be wrong about this. There might have been an easy way to get access to it. Still, I'm not sure that I love the way it's done in the game. There was one quest in particular where I remember getting drunk with Zoltan, Shani, and Dandelion, and it's definitely a quest that was worth experiencing, but the alcohol effect definitely was frustrating a little bit. I should probably also mention the presence of fetch quests. Again, it's an old game and it's not going to be as modern as, modern games, and in a way, it makes it a different experience, and actually I was not unhappy that it was the way that it was, despite the frustrations that I just described. Overall, Witcher 1 is a solid game, and it manages to accomplish some things better, or at least equally as well as its two successors, which was a surprise for me. Especially when it comes to the atmosphere, the soundtrack, and the memorable story. I can see how the combat system and the occasional frustrating quest design could lead to some players having a bad time, but other than that, it's a phenomenal game that has aged very well in many ways, and it's going to be really interesting to see how CDPR will approach the remake, because there's a lot of great stuff that absolutely needs to be preserved. That sums up my thoughts on Witcher 1. I purposely left out some topics like character progression, for example, mostly because it's not something that I really cared about when I decided to play the game, and I want to keep it as short as possible. So yeah, thank you so much for making it to the end. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Do you agree with most of what I said? I want to know. And consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel if you enjoyed. Alright, I'll see you all soon again in a new video. Bye bye.